Well, hello, everybody. Today, we're going to be talking about the toxic aspects of wheat, milk, corn, and soy. And I was reading up about it just recently, and as it is, it's not as straightforward as one might think. You know, everybody has kind of brushed soy with one stroke and said, "Oh, it's bad, it's estrogenic." And so I've invited my dear friend and colleague, Sayer G, who is a walking encyclopedia, to discuss the technical aspects of each one of these foods and how they work for us and how they work against us as well. So welcome, Sayer. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks so much to have me on, Joel. So, we've been doing a lot of, like live streams on various topics, and obviously Green Med Info has so much. It's just that sometimes we forget that the basics are really the most important. And you remind me of that sometimes, because I like to go into very complex areas that are obscure and esoteric, like, free energy, metabolism, right? Like things like that. But the reality is, I think many people still just need a refresher on what is probably the most important of all things for maintaining your health and wellness, and that is navigating the constant challenges of eating, the Western diet. And, one of the things that, when I first started Green Med Info, actually around 2007, I wrote an article called Unglued, the Sticky Truth About Wheat, wheat, dairy, corn, and soy. And it was an interesting article because I started off with just going into the fact that all of those foods are actually used to make industrial adhesives. So, like, for example, books, they use wheat gluten as a mortar or paste for, the binding. And you can make, paper mache, if you think about it, out of just wheat flour and some water. You let it dry and it's this concrete-like substance. I mean, it's very hard to basically break that down in the body. And being that it's used as a glue, that's kind of obvious. And then you have the Elmer's glue cow, right? Elmer the cow was on the front of the Elmer's glue bottle for a reason, is because cow's milk has casein, which is this sticky protein that we aren't really designed to break down because we're not baby cows. So we don't have the same type of stomach that those animals have. And that's also this whole milk mustache campaign where the sticky protein stuck under the nose, right? Then you also have the fact that corn is used for, paper boxes, for example. A lot of the glues are actually derived from corn. And then you have soy, which is actually used as an alternative to formaldehyde-based adhesives for plywood. So you have these 4 sticky proteins that arguably our body doesn't really have the history to break down effectively, meaning biological time. We're dealing with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. So the gene sequences required to break down those specific foods, we just don't have them. And there's something our body does do in order to survive the sort of onslaught of these unique proteins, which is it draws from the microbiome in order to break those things down. But that can cause putrefaction as well as a lot of toxicity. So it's an interesting lens to look at these common foods. The other thing about them is they're really addictive. So we'll get a little bit into that. But that was one of the things that we had discussed, Joel. It's like people that follow Green Med Info, sometimes we forget how important it is to focus back on, what you're eating as being essential for your health.
Well, yeah, and not only that, but I think even people who are proactive, want to make positive changes, and they'll say, well, I'm not going to have the refined grains, I'll have the whole wheat instead, or I'll even go Ezekiel bread, I'll go sprouted grains instead of the refined stuff. But inherent to those are issues as well, from the wheat germ agglutinin to the gluten itself, right? And so causing reactions in the body. So can we start with wheat first? Right.
That's a great one to start with because it's just omnipresent. Still, You do find a lot of gluten-free alternatives now being offered, but the default is, of course, wheat. But some people go to whole wheat, and they go to organic sprouted whole wheat, and they think, oh my gosh, this sounds so biblical. It's Ezekiel 4:9. It's from the Bible, and it's so ancient. Our bodies must know how to utilize that. And there are benefits to sprouting grains. However, interestingly, my research early on led me to conclude that wheat lectin is actually more prevalent in whole wheat and whole sprouted wheat than it is in processed white flour. Because when you take the wheat berry, it's called, it's actually a seed, a grain, and you remove the the wheat germ, which is full of all this great stuff, as well as you remove the outside, which has the fiber and other good things, you end up with just starch, right? And that starch doesn't really have much of the wheat lectin. Now, what's wheat lectin? It's this exceedingly small, really, it's a carbohydrate binding protein. So it's in a category, you could kind of call it a glycoprotein, but they're designed by the seeds to protect them from predation, meaning, if animals want to eat these seeds, the seeds are like, we don't want you to eat us. We're going to put these invisible thorns into the seed that are going to cause some disruption in your body, unless maybe you've had many generations of adaptation to be able to eat that. Now, humans, of course, have had approximately 500 to 1,000 generations, according to conventional evolutionary theory about our origins. I tend to leave this open to debate because I recently have gone back into, I would say, pre-flood, pre-catastrophe evidence that we actually may have had a highly evolved civilization before, the so-called, origin of man through the Darwinian perspective, that basically we were preceded by monkeys and then we evolved from them. I think there's another way of explaining this, where we may have had more time to adjust to grain consumption. That said, the seeds of these grains have these little bristly inflammatory lectins built into them. And in fact, what's interesting about wheat lectin is it binds to what are called glycoaminoglycans, which are a type of substance secreted by our epithelial tissue. So the mucus that we produce contains a lot of this. And that's one reason why when people take glucosamine, the wheat lectin binds to the glucosamine and not our own tissues, reducing inflammation. So that's another connection there.
So, on that vein, what about the evolution of the grain itself?
Yeah.
Because, and I ask you that because here, there's a store in Naples where I am, at Food and Thought here, which you know very well, where they bring in grains from ancient grains from Europe. Actually, I think it's a company out of Houston that brings them in, but Alfie actually took these to get genetically tested in Holland to make sure, because I believe what he was saying is these grains, the ancient grains, only code for approximately 300 proteins versus the conventional grains that we use in America are coding for some upwards of 20,000 different proteins. And so it's a vastly different wheat than we currently use.
Yes.
What's your take on the difference there?
Oh, it's a great thing that you brought this up, because that is true. In fact, what is so unique about modern, bred wheat, if you will, is that it's a hexaploid species. So it has 6 sets of chromosomes, which then produce, according to the proteomic analysis of the wheat proteins, 23,000 distinct proteins in the gluten category. So that's a really good point. So people listening, when you hear of gluten, you think of this monolithic thing, right? It's this one thing, but that's not it at all. In fact, there's 23,000 different what are known as prolamine proteins. Prolamines contain high concentrations of proline. So actually, technically, oats have something called avenin, which is high in prolamine, although it's not gluten per se. So those who are celiac can even consume oats if there's no contamination. Then you have rice, which has another protein in it. God, it's evading me right now, the name of it. I'll come back to it. You have rye, which has seculin. There's a number of other ones. So all the grains we know of, even those that are gluten-free, actually have these sticky proteins called prolamines. And so wheat has 23,000 different ones. Now, why is that a problem? Because each one is difficult for our body to break down. The intestinal wall is only one cell thick, very easy to cause damage and what's called leaky gut syndrome, where undigested contents of your alimentary canal enter the blood. The moment that happens, it could be an undigested protein or lipid or carbohydrate. It goes into the blood, and the adaptive pole of the immunity, Th2, is going to say, oh, wait, that's not self. Let's go tag that with an antibody, or let's go ahead and recruit white blood cells and attack it. And in that process, you lose what's known as immunological self-tolerance, meaning what self and other is confusing. And that's the whole point of having an immune system, right? Is that you have this ability to be able to say, no, what's self, we will keep, and what's not self, we want to keep that in the digestive tract. So interestingly, wheat also has something called a zonulin upregulator, or there's a particle that's also found, or molecule found in wheat, that actually causes the gaps between the enterocytes, right? These cells to open up. So it's almost as if the wheat is designed to cause the intestinal permeability, as well as to deliver inflammatory lectins, and then 23,000 different proteins, which if they're not broken down fully, and by the way, we can't break them down fully because we don't have the enzymes to do that. It's not in our genome. What we do have is a bunch of bacteria, some of them in the infectious disease category, that then are recruited to try to break down these sticky, gummy, inflammatory autoimmunity generating proteins. So it's like this like battle. The body's like, oh my God, well, we have all this gunky stuff that if it goes into our cells, our immune system is going to freak out and attack our own body. Well, let's go get these bacteria that are usually, in small populations to grow to higher levels, like Klebsiella, I think that's the pronouncing, and Clostridium. These are infectious, connected overgrowth bacteria that wheat actually feeds. And so that's an interesting fact of our biology, is that because we can't break these sticky proteins down, and by the way, think about it. If this is used for bookbinding glue or paper mache, can you imagine when you're eating this gunky protein? It's gooey, it's chewy, you swallow it, it starts to just line the inside of your intestines, creating malabsorption issues, because the villi, by the way, are high surface area little, like little fingers that are basically there so they can absorb nutrients and things like B12 that are being synthesized in your gut. When you have this paste that covers it and then causes villi atrophy, you end up in celiac disease, the villi are completely flattened. That's why people are malnourished. So this is a common problem that several studies we reported on show it's a universal issue. It's a species-specific problem, meaning there is not a human on the planet that if you were to go test their villi after consuming wheat, you wouldn't find some atrophy or some inflammation or some permeability. And so that does put a different perspective on wheat. Now, your original point is still the best around the different varieties. Ancient grains like kamut is an example, or versions that were not selectively bred in the past, say 100 years, to have huge amounts of gluten, as well as this amylopectin starch. Dr. William Davis wrote a book called Wheat Belly, which is a great book because it's basically communicating what wheat does. It causes a lot of overweight, obesity, it's diabetogenic, it's connected with metabolic syndrome. And that's because if you think about it, the more addictive the grains are, just like with fructose, the fatter it makes you, the more dysregulated your blood sugar, the more you're just going to keep buying more of it. And unfortunately, in the West, especially in America, foods are weaponized towards being addictive and having very little actually to contribute in terms of nutrition.
Well, yeah, I mean, just look at the standard diet is bagels in the morning or donuts or cereals, and then pizza, pasta. I mean, sandwiches. I mean, that's a huge percentage of the diet. Now, what about versus the heritage grains? Because it's very common to hear stories, including myself, which I don't eat wheat here. If I go to Italy, for example, I'll have maybe a meal or two but I will still feel good and have no issues. And a
Because you're
lot
in
of people,
Italy.
of course, but a lot of people feel the same way. But again, they have heritage grains in Europe. That's
Yeah.
one of the reasons why. Another reason I understand is because they let the dough kind of break down for longer periods of time, 24 hours. So the bacteria actually were able to break down the gluten,
And the yeast.
and the yeast. The
Yep.
yeast is actually able to break it down for longer periods of time, making it easier. Is it
Mm.
still affecting people to a lower degree because it is wheat, or is it not affecting people at all? Because we know here it affects everybody, whether you feel it or not, whether you're celiac or you're more maybe asymptomatic after eating wheat, it will affect you. Like you were saying, it affects the immune system. It leads to autoimmune disease, irritable bowel syndrome. It leads to rheumatoid
Oh,
arthritis. It leads to Alzheimer's disease in the brain. It leads to depression, anxiety. There's a whole list of things that are, I think it's 55 diseases that are caused from eating gluten here, right? But a lot of people don't notice it when they're eating it in Europe. Would you
yeah.
recommend, like, if you're in Europe, yeah, go for it, or still you don't recommend it?
Well, to your point, really quickly, I just want to pull up the Green Med Info database on wheat, which I spent many years putting together, which is very interesting because you'll see that there are actually 236 different conditions that I was able to find in the medical literature are linked to wheat consumption. So, because my premise was, okay, it's not just an allergy, it's not just a rare issue, because, for example, the genetic sequence for celiac disease, right, is actually found in as high as a third of the human population. Even though those who are sensitive to the degree that an infinitesimal amount, trace contamination could cause them to be deadly ill from it. The reality is it's like a submerged iceberg, and it's a matter of degree of harm, not, black or white. So for those who don't know, we have also analyzed 22 different modes of toxicity, from neurotoxicity, which is interesting. That's one of the most, and we'll get into this, one of the most not well known adverse effects from consuming wheat, but connects as well to its highly addictive qualities. So we'll get into that. But going back to your question, I do believe that you are absolutely onto something here, which is that in Europe, there's a very different process in terms of how they also harvest their wheat. Because one of the big things that's happened in the past decade is people woke up to glyphosate, right? But unfortunately, now people, whenever I mention the work I've done on educating about wheat's toxicity, they're like, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about. It's just glyphosate." And I'm just like, why does it have to be so black and white, or either or? It's like, no, it is actually true that, yes, occasionally they use glyphosate as a pre-harvest desiccant, which is a terrible idea. To spray this crap on the grain they're going to harvest to try to make it drier so they can get it to market quicker, and it's extremely toxic. But it's not always used for that reason, and ultimately, it's the type of grain itself that is the most important. Like, so spelt, for example, rye, kamut, these are ancient grains that haven't really been selectively bred, and certainly haven't been genetically modified for mass consumption, to my knowledge. And that's an example of nature / God / civilization producing something that has helped us as a species get here to our present survivorship, if you will. So it's like we have to honor the things that were natural, that got us here. And therefore, I think that, generally speaking, the problem is actually the quality and the type of grain, not so much that you can't eat grains at all. Because at one point I was a big advocate of that. Anyone listening who's tried it, it's not easy. Joelle, you're one of the few people I know on the planet with discipline. So you're just like, I'm not going to eat this, and you just don't, and you feel good. But for some, it's life-saving when they remove grains as a whole. But what I ask everyone to try, anyone listening who has not done this, is just remove wheat and remove cow's milk from your diet, the two most toxic, the most addictive substances. And generally speaking, you're going to see your health improve and your whole life is going to change. That's my general promise to the public. And there's reasons we can go deeper into, that establish why.
And that's definitely my clinical experience as well, working with tons of patients over the years. Is just those are the two things that I tell everybody to get off if they have any issues, whether ranging from inflammation in the joints, right, and pain, to anxiety or depression. And it's incredible at actually what it does to the brain. And you just touched on that. So why don't we go deeper into how does eating wheat affect my brain and cause brain inflammation?
This is a great question. I'm going to put a little placeholder on that because one thing I wanted to bring up earlier was like I love gluten-free bread alternatives. Like I have this like Mountain, whatever the brand is, gluten-free bagels. And the thing about gluten-free food is it's actually often higher glycemic, meaning it makes your blood sweeter faster than whole wheat bread would, So, and interestingly, a lot of the gluten-free foods use potato or rice. And in my research, what was interesting about lectins is that potato and rice also has a wheat germ, a glutenin-like or wheat lectin-like binding capacity, meaning it will cause irritation in the joints and it could cause further issues with leaky gut syndrome. So that is just something for people to know who may not realize this. And that's why we talked earlier about why sometimes going grain-free is the best approach. Okay, wait, your question, the next topic was
just
going to be
affecting the brain, like leading to brain inflammation.
So the number one thing, and that's why I mentioned the glycemic index, is if you think about it, eating high glycemic foods of any kind, it's a neuroendocrine roller coaster. So in theory, it's as if when your blood sugar goes up, your body treats it as an emergency. We know that the main issue with blood pressure, cardiovascular disease related to food, it's actually from sugar causing glycation, which is basically caramelization of the blood, which causes these binding of glucose with carbohydrates, sometimes proteins, and they cause these what's called advanced glycation end products, which are AGEs. It's really kind of a clever. And what happens is the lining of the, interestingly, endothelial tissue in your cardiovascular system is also only one cell thick. We have to be so aware of the delicate nature of our tissue. So epithelial tissue is your skin, it's your alimentary canal, prostate, breast, cardiovascular arteries, and vessels. So ultimately, what happens is when the blood sugar goes up, the body treats it as a goddamn emergency. Stress hormones are released, cortisol, for example, and that's also going. And then insulin is released, and that causes it to crash. If your brain goes without sugar for just say 3 minutes, it's like an emergency. Again, it's like being deprived of oxygen. So you end up in this neuroendocrine roller coaster with grains that are insulin releasing and or high glycemic. And by the way, you could talk about fructose in that regard too. It's terrible. It has a lot of similar issues. So that's number one. But the second thing, which is really interesting to folks, is that wheat has a opioid-like effect in the human body. Isn't that interesting? So in other words, it has gluten exorphins, which are these peptides that actually lock into the opioid receptors, where naturally morphine, which we can actually produce small amounts like human breast does, for example, that there is a addictive property to wheat that I think approximates what you would get from even conventional opioids. And so and you only know this when you remove it. Like people are walking around the world, have never removed wheat from their diet, and they're just dopey as anything. They just think they were born dopey. They don't understand. They're just guzzling coffee, trying to stimulate their mind when it's the weed is just drugging them, turning them into like little zombies. And so often it's as simple as removing wheat from your diet, and it's almost like just a veil is lifted, right? Like the gauze is lifted from your eyes, and you're just like, oh my God, my body is free, my mind is clear. So that's not true of other grains. It's actually why I believe wheat was bred in this way. It's part of the premise in The Dark Side of Wheat ebook, which you're welcome to download if you go to greenmedinfo.com/newsletter. We're giving away this classic, which was downloaded, I don't know, 500,000 times since it was written in 2007. And in that, we talk about how the wheat empire, which is the Roman Empire, used the grain economy to conquer, the vanquished and convert them into this like juggernaut of an imperial system that also in many ways drugged and also malnourished the vanquished. So it turns you into a bit of a zombie, an addicted zombie. And that's what bread and circuses were. Bread and circuses were a political strategy to entertain and amuse their population, and then also give them free bread, because that was one thing that you did. It's like when you feed ducks, right? They end up dying from that damn flour you're giving them. And but it's so addictive, they can't stop eating it, right?
So that's one thing. What about like the sad part to me is watching children be fed the standard American diet, and then they're completely unable to focus. And of course, they're labeled with ADD, ADHD, and put on Ritalin medication.
Yeah.
But grains themselves, wheats specifically, because it crosses the gut and leads to leaky gut, and then you got these proteins that affect your immune system. There's a whole process by which it stimulates interleukin 1, 6, and I think another one, and it leads to cytokine responses. That crosses the blood-brain barrier.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
that leads to real brain inflammation, and brain inflammation leads to not just brain fog, but over time, brain neuron degeneration.
Absolutely. In fact, it was our colleague, Dr. Tom O'Brien, who reported a while back on the study showing that wheat consumption actually cuts blood flow off to the neocortex of the brain. I was like, wow, they had these functional MRI studies on it and everything. And I was like, this is so interesting. And then we have other interesting research that emerged related to glutathione depletion. So both cow's milk and gluten actually suppress the production of glutathione in our cells, which is an essential endogenous antioxidant, without which we can't survive the onslaught of chemicals in our environment, and certainly we get accelerated aging. It's a very interesting topic, but when it comes to the discovery that grains have a link with psychiatric disorders, this was one of the most interesting of all things that I found in the early research. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here to see if I can find this very fascinating article about schizophrenia. Is that what they found was during World War II, as I recall, is that there was shortages of certain foods, and wheat was one of the things that at the mental institution, they started having lower levels of rations. And what they did is they ultimately cut the rations of schizophrenic patients of gluten-containing grains, and they saw remarkable remissions of certain cases and improvement in many of the other people within the institutions. So that was the first signal, I think I'll find it on page 3, of how profoundly gluten-containing grains are actually contributing. Here's the one here, let me show you this one first. This was the one that I was talking about. Oh yeah, then I have the link. Is that gluten brain, wheat cuts off blood flow to the frontal cortex. And then that's where I go into the 60 years of research linking gluten grains to schizophrenia. And this was a fascinating discovery that has now been backed up.
And prefrontal cortex, that's mood, decision-making, autonomic nervous system, immune system. I mean, so coordination to the limbs. So you literally get better coordination if you're off of gluten. It's pretty incredible.
Exactly. It's a fascinating subject. And, guys, it's interesting for those who are here, is that there was something known as St. Anthony's Fire, where basically in the Middle Ages, entire villages would end up being plagued by demonic possession, where their skin would burn, and it was coming from within, and and they found out it was because of what's known as ergotized rye, or grains basically being infected by a fungus. And that's actually how they discovered LSD-25, was an extract of rye, ergotized rye. So grains have a very interesting psychiatric history. And ultimately, when you look at the connection with ADHD, You look at depression, you look at schizophrenia, psychoses. It's interesting how psychoactive these foods actually are. And so keep that in mind for those who are dealing with, the challenges of the day. You'd be surprised that when you remove this factor from your life, it just clears you. That's one of the things that I've noticed, and then when you add it back in, if you want to get fancy, you'll notice you're like, wow, you almost get drugged. And what happens? Okay, when you eat something delicious, which is a glutinous, let's say it's a fresh baked bread with butter on it, give it about 10, 20, 30 minutes. When the peptides start get broken down, then they release this opioid secondary effect. And by the way, it's addictive, right? Like, how much bread can you eat? I mean, do you ever feel satisfied? Not until you get a stomach ache, usually. So, keep that in mind. These aren't foods so much for nourishment, and certainly not in terms of their so-called information carrying properties, which are essential for healthy genes. For example, vegetables and fruits have these little exosomes full of microRNA, which regulate our gene expression. And when you eat cereal grasses in the form of their babies, their grains, they also have microRNAs, but they're not necessarily as good for you as those foods we foraged for, millennia, millions of years actually, before the advent of pyrotechnology, which is cooking, right? And having ways to store grains. All this came later with official civilization. So it's very interesting. Yeah.
We have a question here from Rick. It says, is einkorn considered an ancient grain?
It is, and it's interesting because it's Sumerian, as I recall. And if you look back to the Sumerian culture, I mean, everything just exploded out of nowhere in terms of the historical record, from all the cuneiform tablets to the Abrahamic religions, really all started from the advent of the Sumerian, I guess, miracle, because there's nothing there before. Now, I believe there was a cataclysm that erased the memory of the high civilizations that preceded Lemuria, Atlantis, Mu. You look at the megalithic records around the world of these 1,000-ton megaliths, perfectly mitered, that were moved somehow by magic, because we don't have the machinery to do that ourselves today. So it's interesting. I do think einkorn is part of the first sort of expression of humanity in the form of civilization, but it's a very interesting story as to, what's behind that. And my second book that I'm working on, Ancient Futures, is going to be about that. You have to strap yourself in for that. It's going to be fun.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And on that note, if anybody has questions, feel free to ask some questions. That's why we're here. Can you touch on wheat germ agglutinin as well? Because that's one of the elements that's found in wheat that we haven't discussed yet.
Absolutely. And that's what's interesting about things like wheat germ. I remember my grandma used to make me oatmeal, and I loved wheat germ. It just tasty, delicious. Embryo, like inside of the seed, have all these delicious oils. And there is actually also a little lectin there. The thing about wheat germ is that it's full of vitamin E, other essential fatty acids. It's super healthy. It doesn't have gluten in it, but it does have some wheat germ agglutinin, as does wheatgrass. Now, those who have used wheatgrass to heal know that it's incredible. You can put diseases into remission with wheatgrass. And why is that? Well, interestingly, it has some lectin, but it also has meristematic cells, which are immortal plant cells. And it has chlorophyll, and it has other living enzymes and life force. But as far as wheat lectin, the wheat lectin can cause inflammation. So people eating the Ezekiel sprouted bread are like, oh, it's biblical, it's great, it's sprouted, it's organic, and why am I still inflamed? Well, because in theory, living things, again, be it grass, a sprouted seed, they want to live. They don't want to be chomped down by mammals like us. So they've devised over the course of time these little invisible thorns, if you will, which are called lectins. And it's to say, all right, well, you can nibble on me here, you'll get some benefits, but don't make your whole life around eating this one thing. So that's kind of what has gone wrong. And by the way, for those who don't know this, when you're doing animal husbandry and you're feeding cows, right? If you feed them grains, they get so sick because of the acidosis caused by these grains in their four-chambered stomach that they literally have to punch holes into the side of these animals to put antibiotics in and to relieve the gases that are produced. It's a disgusting thing. They're not supposed to eat grains. Grains are the babies, they're the seeds. They could survive for thousands of years. In fact, look at this. This is from the Great National Sequoia Park, and this is from the oldest tree, this thing right here. It's like a time capsule. But that's like a grain. It's meant to survive thousands of years. So there are going to be phytates, which are anti-nutrients. There's going to be lectins that are going to prevent you from consuming it. So keep that in mind. Now, once it's sprouted, that's more aligned with something that maybe we would naturally eat. But grains, try taking a handful of grains without cooking it and chewing on it. It's just not a good experience, right? So I don't know if that answered the question or not.
Yeah, that answers the question. Like, you're talking about and bringing up lectins again. Dr. Gundry's book, Plant Paradox, talks about that. I don't know if he quoted you in that book, but definitely mentioned your work in a few articles that had written prior to his book, in his book. One of the things taken from there is also the timing. Like, because in that book, they're like, well, avoid tomatoes, avoid cucumbers, avoid a whole list, all the nightshades, avoid all of those things in order to avoid lectins. But there's a difference. When the plant is ready to be consumed, it has a desire to be consumed because it wants to spread its seed and sow its seed.
Poetry to my ears. Okay, thank you.
Right. And so the lectin levels drop at that time. And so that's the beauty of having local food, eating local food that is in your environment, that has a type of communication with you that you wouldn't otherwise have in terms of compared to mass production.
Amen. Beautiful point, because now you're connecting it with Regenerate, because the book Regenerate was actually a large part about how, when you look at the coevolutionary history between what are known as angiosperm plants, the flowering seed-bearing plants that make up 70% of the food we consume today. They include cereal grasses, right? The grains of which we eat. They include, apples and berries and vegetables, those things that flower and produce seed or fruit. Is that those species actually started to erupt in their complexity and success on this biosphere at the same time as complex animal life, which, according to conventional evolutionary biology, is around 200 million years ago. It's called Metazoa 2.0. It's an event where you see this wild flowering of complexity, right? And so what happened is that there was a little bit of a love story between these two, if you will, super families, right? Between animals and these angiosperm plants, which is that they started to become so dependent on each other that these plants, right, wanted to distribute their seed. Well, here's a cute little animal with big eyes, wants to eat fruit. You're like, hey, eat my beautiful fruit. Okay. And then it eats it, shits it out, and that seed goes and populates another area. And those plants have this beautiful relationship. Now, what does that animal get from that relationship? It gets fed, and it gets this amazing nourishment. In fact, it even gets microRNAs, which help to optimize its gene expression. So that beautiful relationship is actually at the foundation of why certain foods are essential for our health and wellness in actually modulating our gene expression. And if we just focus on, let's say, grains, which, again, this is great that you brought up einkorn, Rick. There's something about the advent of agrarian civilization, which was the beginning of the degeneration of humanity and the enslavement of humanity, as well as the enslavement of animals with animal husbandry. Preceding that, you have more of a Garden of Eden view, where you have these beautiful fruits, you just take them right from the tree and you can survive. Now, keep in mind, the thing about grains that make them so powerful is you can store them, which is actually along the axis of time not possible in a more equatorial zone where you have the jungle, where things are going to be fully, you're going to have a whole panoply of delicious foods to eat all day, things that just fall from the trees, but you can't preserve them. There's this constant. So when you start storing grains, you actually start storing power, and it's actually capital that you're creating. It's the first form of capital. So if you can store the grains for several years, you suddenly have concentrated power. And in climates, especially higher latitudes, let's take Northern Europe, you can't survive during the winter. You have to have storage of food, and you have to have technologies that enable you to survive. Whereas if you're at the equator picking food off the trees, you can live in the moment. You're in a different tribal scenario. So it's a very interesting view of how, humans end up creating these very different ways of living. Yeah.
Okay, so we have a few questions here. What about sourdough, organic
Yeah.
bread?
Great idea. This is great, guys. You guys are so smart and we love engagement. So sourdough is actually a brilliant way to use the yeast to break down these gluten proteins that we can't digest. So instead of us having to deal with it after we eat the meal, and we're just like, oh, I have a stomach ache, and then, it doesn't even eliminate properly. You have these yeasts that are breaking down these complex gluten proteins into their substrates. Now, some of that will actually break them down into those addictive gluten exorphins and gliadorphin. That's why sourdough is so delicious. Now, guys, I'm not saying that you shouldn't get a high from eating food. Like, that's half the beauty of food. It's called the cephalic phase of nutrition. You want to enjoy your food, and there are worse things you could be addicted to. So yes, but just know that when you're doing this, it is a form of self-medication, and that ultimately, I don't know how many people are benefiting from eating sourdough bread for their overall health. If it's balanced with organic butter, with a nice side salad, it's all about it's a combination that matters. But yes, sourdough is one of the best ways to eat grains where you're not getting the downsides. And that is why, actually, over many millennia, cultures developed sourdough and fermentation processes. That's also true for soy. It's because, that's going to enable it to be more medicinal, actually.
What part of soy enables it to be more medicinal?
So like tempeh is a good example. It's Indonesian,
Yeah.
and they're using a mold. It's actually Aspergillus niger. So it's the same thing as black mold. It's a different strain. I actually like tempeh, and I don't seem to have much sensitivity to it, but it breaks down some of those protease inhibitors, which interestingly are their benefit for treating cancer. So in other words, there's a category of oncogenic treatments, which are, oncological treatments that are basically protease inhibitors, because cancers produce a lot of protein. So you use these chemical, or you could use natural protease inhibitors. Well, one of them is soy. Soy has this property of being able to directly inhibit protease. However, that's not good if your pancreas is trying to produce protease to break down the soy protein. So, so everything has its place. You could eat soy to fight a cancer, or you could eat soy, it might cause a stomach ache if it's not fermented. But we do want to talk about soy at some point too, because it has, a bad
Well,
rap.
we have a few questions, so why don't we start
Yeah.
with that?
Oh,
That's
I
what they
love
were asking.
questions.
Tofu, natto,
Yeah,
tempeh. Is that good? I mean, natto, miso, tempeh, those are the fermented soys.
definitely. Natto, I love. I mean, although my present partner, she tricked me the first day we met on a date. I was like, oh, I'm all about fermented soy, and she tested me. She said, and she created like all these natto servings. It's disgusting. It's like this goopy, smells bad, and it's just like wet socks. And I was like, okay, I want to prove that I was, man enough to try it. But but it's gross. But it is powerful. It has, yes, if you can eat natto, do it. I take nattokinase daily. It's an enzyme, and it breaks down fibrin, keeps my blood flowing. And then, of course, some people are taking it because of spike protein, which is a study that actually Joelle brought to my attention. It can help break down that, sort of GMO protein being, produced in those who are vaccinated. Buckwheat.
I did a video on the Green Med Info page on Unite about the nattokinase. So
Oh, that's right. We got to get that back out. It's such a good video. That can save lives, because so many people who got the vaccine are producing this protein that nattokinase can literally break down.
So what's the story about? What's the story? I'm going to change subject, but keep it on tofu and soy. What's the story about just the estrogenic effects of soy? So everyone's saying, well, women could have soy depending on what part of their cycle they're on, right? Or men shouldn't because they'll develop gynecomastia or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. So what's your take on soy in general?
I've been so wanting to answer this question, Joel, for years. I wanted to create a white paper about it because it's such an important question. So the thing about soy is, in the East, it's known as the vegetable cow because you can produce protein and milk from it. It's just this amazing food. And then if you look at Asians generally who consume a lot of soy, they have relatively low rates of cancer. They're in good shape. It's a whole nother epidemiology over there in their soy-based culture. Now, why are people so freaked out about soy? It has a lot to do with the history of the way in which the medical establishment manipulated women with initially this promise through hormone replacement of eternal life and youthfulness, because pharma wanted to create an extract of pregnant, horse urine, Premarin, and they wanted to go ahead and make women think that if they took their synthetic hormones that they would never grow old. Ultimately, that experiment ended up with many women having heart attacks, having cancer. And so, in other words, pharma created a synthetic hormone nightmare. And when it was clear that it was causing deaths in them from cancers and heart disease, they were like, oh no, it's because it's an estrogen. Oh, so then what they did next? They went ahead and they switched gears to breast cancer, where they started to focus on a new category of pharmaceuticals for women, which were estrogen blockers, like tamoxifen and Arimidex. And that's AstraZeneca's history, is that they created Breast Cancer Awareness Month in 1985 as a pharma ploy to get women who are healthy to get their breasts scanned for, indications of breast cancer when they're healthy, and they'd see calcifications and they'd say, oh, I'm sorry, that looks like it could be breast cancer, let's cut it out. So then they switched gears and they told women, oh no, hormones are dangerous, including the ones you produce, so let's sell you these hormone blockers. So in that nightmare of the medical establishment taking advantage of women, because there's a lot of misogyny, obviously, in the history of medicine, and then they switched to osteoporosis next, by the way, which is a whole nother deal, which is, osteopenia, osteoporosis, and just targeting women who don't have disease, they're just aging, but telling them, oh, your bones.
Soy has benefits on bone mass as well.
Yeah, and quality, and exactly. And that's the thing. And so soy is actually very beneficial because one of the things that it has is an isoflavone, which is a phytoestrogen that binds to the receptors in our bodies for these hormones, but it's a weak signal. It binds longer, blocking out the bad estrogen, which could be from exogenous sources, which include bisphenol A or, metalloestrogens from antiperspirants that act just like estrogen. So technically what soy does is it provides a body armor for your receptors to block the signal from these more dominant synthetic ones that are in the environment. Now, some people produce their own estradiol, which is a very powerful estrogen. And in excess, that can, yes, lead to proliferation of tissue. Soy also is a way to modulate that. So what I've seen in terms of research is that soy is actually extremely good for preventing breast cancer, preventing hormone-related cancers, as well as recurrence after they have been treated. So, it was a little bit of a clickbait here with, the toxic truth about soy, because I really wanted to talk more about how soy is beneficial and also why technically there was a study, I'm actually going to be sending it out in the newsletter soon, around genistein is the fermented form of genistein, which is in soy. Now, if you eat regular soy, your body's going to break some of that down into genistein. That genistein is super powerful. In fact, I should probably look this up on Greenman Info to show everybody how many benefits it has. One of which is it was studied in comparison to Fosamax, and then another bone drug as being superior in helping support bone density and quality, and without any of the risks, so that's the beauty of it. Yeah, this is great, Joel. We haven't done this kind of thing in a while.
I know, it's great.
Yeah.
There's so much to talk about.
I know.
It's unbelievable, because now I'm thinking, well, my advice to people is you have to stay away from genetically modified soy. Most of the soy in America is genetically modified, high levels of chemicals, et cetera, et cetera. But overall, if you're, soy is good for you.
Yeah, in fact, I should show people the soy page, because
pull it up for sure.
Yeah, because that's exactly it. I've been meaning to do this. In fact, I should still probably write a white paper about soy, because it's such a powerful protector of health when we're dealing with thousands of xenoestrogens.
Xenoestrogens
Xenoestrogens from the environment. our servers are down a little slow today, guys. So we're just trying to work on that right
Here's a
now. But
question from Leah
yeah,
Richardson. I am gluten-free and plant-based and feel organic soy is okay, even though I don't think it's great for the environment as far as planting, but question mark. So are you okay with that?
yeah, it's
The
a
only
problem.
thing I would say here is being gluten-free is good. You really have to watch and read the ingredients in the product though. Because I feel like people get
Yeah,
there are great gluten-free products out there that are excellent,
yeah,
but a
yeah.
lot of people will get um,
Mm,
confused. They won't read the other ingredients, so there'll be horrible oils in there
mm.
that are super inflammatory to the body, or they'll add just a ton of refined sugar or things like that. So
Oh,
I always advise people read the ingredients. If you could understand the ingredients, even in gluten-free, just because it says gluten-free doesn't
mm,
mean it's great.
mm,
Um,
mm.
but there are great gluten-free products out there. So
Yeah, exactly. And I was going to make a point, which for me, soy is really more a medicine than a food. So that, yes, there could be examples of where if enough soy is consumed, let's say you're chugging a bottle of soy milk a day, it could actually cause some estrogen dominance in a phenotypal expression, meaning like so-called man boobs, right? There is something to it that does potentially feminize the body. That is possibly one of the outcomes of excessive soy. Soy is really more like a medicine, and that's why consuming it also in fermented form, you're dealing less with, I think, some of those downsides. And I do agree that soy, unfortunately, is so when you look at the biosphere of the planet, what's happened is monoculturing has destroyed the biodiversity. So you're dealing, and by the way, for the vegans out there, unfortunately, the monoculturing of these popular, plant-based foods is actually causing just infinite death of all the different animals that would naturally exist if the biosphere was intact and we had biodiversity. So it's, unfortunately not true that the vegans are, their hands aren't red from that reality. But the thing is that you definitely want to consume it intentionally. I mean, when you make tempeh, for example, and you soak it in like some spices and you properly prepare it, it is so delicious, It's like you don't even need meat, right? And then you get some of these other benefits. It's just that the mentality of the public, due to pharma's very engineered propaganda, is that people are afraid that soy is going to cause them harm, even cancer, which is absolutely not the case. Yeah, in fact, I'm going to go
what's
show you. Yeah,
here's a question as you're looking for that. What's the best source of genistein?
good
Is it
question.
Miso?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, genistein is in the fermented form of genistin. So you have dodson, glycitin, and there's one other one, dodson, glycitin. I'll remember it. Oh, genistin. And they go to dodzine, glycitine, and genistein when fermented. So, so you get those precursors in any soy, and in theory, your gut will break some of that down into the active form. By the way, here you're seeing 312 diseases that I was able to find that seem to benefit from some component of soy. And why wouldn't that be the case, guys? If God created this thing and entire civilizations that have been around for thousands of years, not just like 200, what is it, 50 years for us, around that, then there's something that's working. So let's like honor tradition. Let's try to use common sense. And of course, that's why Greenman Info exists. Is so we have all this research that also supports, tradition. But look at that. I mean, like, it's like it is. That's why the hippies in the 70s, everyone drank soy milk. Like soy was a new thing, and I think it was very beneficial. 114 different positive pharmacological actions. That's what I love about Greenman Info, right? It's like we've been doing this for practically 20 years. And after a while, you start to index enough research where you're like, wow, this is impressive, And maybe when you go and you eat your soy burger, hopefully it's a tempeh burger, you feel like it's medicine. And that has an additional benefit to your health versus in the back of your mind, you're like, oh, wait, pharma propaganda media said, oh, it's going to cause cancer,
What
because
about
that's,
tofu? What about tofu versus fermented soy?
I
Just
mean,
harder to digest.
yeah. Well, think about foods too in terms of their heat, cold versus hot. And the thing about soy is it's cooling. So, Sorry, I'm just looking that we actually have our first YouTube video stream from this one ever since they deplatformed us. So that's fun and that's nice. So it's a cooling food. You eat meat, it warms you up. Just think commonsensically. So if you're eating a lot of meat and you want to cool off a little bit, and your body's like in overdrive, it's too animal. You want more vegetative, more yoga, more regeneration. Just add a little soy. Use common sense. That's one way to do it. Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
Good advice.
Okay. I want to talk about dairy too, real quick. Monsanto created a synthetic hormone called recombinant bovine growth hormone. Now it's so sick that the cows given it, their mammary glands would get so large that they would drag on the ground and get infected, at which point they need even more antibiotics. And it was all to increase production. Now think about generations now that have experienced this hormone, where you have girls that are 12, right, that are super developed. That's what we've done to our own.
Well, it's starting at 8 and 9 years old now. It's incredible.
Exactly. It's accelerated the development of their sexuality and their mammary glands. And that's kind of the sickness of what we've had to deal with dairy. So dairy by itself, if it's from organic sources, maybe it's beta casein alpha 2 variety. That's a whole nother story. Yeah.
We have to touch on that as well.
Yeah. So guys, my origin story, I was sick as ever when I was born. And it's because for whatever reason, I didn't want breast milk after 5 months, and I went on cow's milk formula and I got terribly sick. So that was my origin story. And I didn't turn out till 17 that I knew that if I stopped drinking cow's milk, all my asthma went away. Even if I do a little bit now, still today, I still get asthma. Not that I couldn't clear that through some kind of spiritual technique, right? But the point is that cow's milk, for me, I've had to explore it deeply, is that there's beta casein. This casein protein also has a morphine-like substance in it. It's called caseomorphine. And think about it. If you're a baby animal born in the wild, and you have your mother's breast as a source of nourishment and just thermically, emotionally, physically, it would help that there's some morphine in there, right? And it would help the mom, because if that baby's crying all the time, that's not a good thing. So it literally is like morphine. I remember my daughters, they'd get a sip of breast milk, their eyes would go back their head. They're just like totally satisfied. Well, that's what people are doing. We're still on the teat of another proxy animal, and we're getting their opioid. Because think about it. It's like rotting lymph fluid. That's what cheese is, what people will eat, right? It's disgusting. But people don't care because it harkens back to their mother's breast. If they were, and it's just this weird thing that we do to get it from another animal. Now,
just so people know, I was holding off talking about milk because I know where Sarah sits on this, and it's hard to convince him that A2 casein is actually good and not as inflammatory or not inflammatory in the body compared to A1. Which causes a whole host of different problems, but I was holding him back, but he can't.
Yeah, I can't help myself.
Well, look, I love it.
Even homeopathy, as I pointed out, if you think about the use of sugar pills, it's lactose, which immediately, if you think about it, you take any lactose, it harkens back to the first time you were nourished by your mother, the most healing experience on the planet after being just thrown into this cold, crazy world, and you go to your mom's breast, you get that drink of milk. That's one reason why homeopathy works. That placebo effect, that's my theory. Now, cow's milk, protein, casein, is extremely hard to break down. It's used for glue, guys. That's what Elmer's glue was made from. So we don't have the ability. Like, these cows have 4-chambered stomachs. They ferment the grass. They chew the cud. They ferment the casein, theoretically, where they have the enzymes to break it down. So that's part of the problem with milk, is it creates a lot of actually inflammation. And in fact, it's alien to our physiology, which is why it activates the goblet cells that produce mucus. That's true for wheat too, by the way. And that's part of the glutathione depletion connection. So it's like treated like an allergy, because think about it. Mucus is to surround the offending substance. So that's one indication, guys, if you're ever eating anything and you start getting a little mucus, it's like, oh, your body says it doesn't want it. So you have so much intelligence built into your system, because for many millions of years, when you're picking through the woods for a berry or a mushroom, if you didn't immediately know whether that was good for you or not, you could die. You know, that's how we survive. So when you look at the homunculus image of the nervous system, right? You probably know more about this, Joelle, than I. The lips and the mouth of that little man are so huge because the neurology is programmed where if you're putting something in your mouth, you've got to know whether it's good or not. This is like when
highly sensitive with a lot of
exactly.
ears. Yeah.
So where do we get our calcium? People say, well, you know what? That's one of the greatest myths of all. The cows are eating magnesium-rich grass. They're not, eating chunks of chalk. So technically, and why is that? Because we convert magnesium into calcium in our body, and that's part of biotransmutation, which is not taught to us because it's part of the new biophysics. It's in my book, but that's the truth, is you convert magnesium into calcium within your cells. So just get more magnesium. Why do cows secrete so much calcium? Because they're eating grass all day, right?
It's good. Do you want to move on to corn now? So, hey,
yes.
let me finish. Let me finish. And you agree or disagree with this thought. My advice to people when it comes to dairy is A2 casein from grass-fed organic cows that is non-pasteurized. In other words, the way it was done centuries ago, your body will deal with that far better. Any other type of dairy, absolutely no, stay away from. Stay away. The pasteurization affects the chemical structure, right? The genetic modification of the A1 to A2 affects the inflammatory pathways, right? And then the grass versus grain-fed is a night and day difference in the fat concentrations.
Yeah.
So I feel like if somebody does that, I know you're still not a fan.
No, I'm okay. You know what's interesting? My mom has blonde hair, blue eyes, fair skin. My dad's Korean. Yeah, I know. Yes. And when I look at her, I'm like, she's always been able to consume cow's milk. And one of my daughters actually is more in that kind of like genetic lineage somehow.
Yeah.
So I think that's correct, because Koreans didn't have that history. And my dad is funny. He's, mid 80s, and he still sometimes eats cow's milk and doesn't know why he's sneezing. And I'm like, Dad, it's like, it's not traditional, but that's the truth. Yeah. Is that some genetic types maybe even need it. And when I read Gandhi's treatise on nutrition, what I found so interesting was, their vegetarian culture is they're not vegans, because he said you have to have some animal product in order, and it would be milk in this case, to be healthy. So technically you may be onto something there, buddy.
All right. Thanks for giving me an inch.
We'll celebrate later and have instead of beer, we'll have some milk. And by the way, goat's milk is the universal foster milk. You can feed it to any mammal. It's what I consume. I'm such a great example. I can have goat's milk and I'm fine. But if you give me cow's milk, and I'm just totally devastated.
All right. You want to touch on corn before we wrap it up?
Yeah. So corn is, to me, a healthy food, especially if you can get heirloom corn. But generally, the way it's created into paste, it's in gluten-free products. It is higher glycemic that way. It is pasty. Just keep in mind, like, the system that we're dealing with here doesn't like pasty, sticky, grimy foods, right? Like, that are just coating the inside of your intestine. And that's why this whole, so talk is about these toxic foods when they're eaten in that form. But if it's conscious and it's done, in the right way, which, hopefully we have, actually Regenerate Masterclass has some really good cooking modules with Tanya. And that's more of what we're going to be working on, showing you how cooking and eating these things can be medicine if done properly. So corn generally I don't have a problem with, but when it's processed, and of course, here's one big deal, guys. People don't realize this, but in 2000 and gosh, let me pull this up, because this was such an important study about the EPA silently approving new messenger RNA corn. Yeah. In fact, I reported on it here, and then obviously, as we know, the whole world went crazy. So I haven't been able to do my job on letting people be aware of just how big of a deal this is. where most of the corn out now has this new GMO corn that is like, the vaccine platforms. Let's mess with people's messenger RNA. Let's create, antigen producing cells by injecting them with it. Like that, the mRNA platforms manipulating RNA is what they're doing with foods. They're doing that with vaccines. It's the new medicines they're trying to roll out. And so this is a really important thing. And corn is one of the things that unfortunately has now been implemented without people even knowing. I mean, it's really a big issue. So yeah, okay, that's the article. I want to see if I can share the screen real quick with you guys. Oh, why is it not showing? Yeah, there it is. Yeah, so I reported on it in 2017. Geez. And that's when the EPA went ahead and silently approved. This was a Monsanto Dow collaboration, two of the most lovely of all companies. And what they did is that they basically used a double-stranded, as I recall, messenger RNA corn to try to have certain, pesticide-like properties. Oh yeah, and this was the study I found that basically
uses pesticides.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
It's ridiculous.
Exactly. And so this is in our food supply across the country right now. And the problem is Monsanto themselves funded this study. This was from, 2000, and when was this? 2008, where they went into the targets of these exogenous small RNAs in grain in the human genome, and they found that technically the target overlapped with all these cell structures within the human genome. And what their conclusion was, oh, that's great, because that means, it's natural. But no, it's the opposite, is that means that when you eat the corn, it can inhibit the functioning of your cells, like on a really significant level. So it's like, I don't want to be hyperbolic here, but just throwing a grenade, at your physiology to be consuming this kind of food. And, there's a lot of discussion around edible vaccines. So they're taking away consent, right? Obviously, by engineering the antigens into the foods we're consuming. And then, you can't take them out of the biosphere. That was the whole thing with Monsanto. They're tinkering with our biosphere. You can't undo that. So that's not cool, but it is something we're facing. So if you're going to eat corn, you got to make sure it's organic. And that goes for almost everything, folks. It's good to be reminded of this, is like, we're in a time and age where if you're not eating organic, then you can be pretty assured that you're getting poisoned, I mean, that's not exaggeration. Yeah.
Yeah, hard to find the non-GMO corn in America these days. Very difficult to find.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm gonna rapid fire a couple questions off, because we have like 5 or 6 questions here before.
Okay, cool. And then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah. So non-GMO wheat can still be a hybrid with tons of gluten? ? That's from Sharon Ray.
Yeah, exactly. It's not GMO, it's selectively bred. So it's like hybridized, if you will. So that's a little different. So it's better to stick with the ancient grains. Absolutely. Yeah. It's harder to make bread with them, not as much gluten in them, but you can find brands, even Ezekiel 4:9. I think they have like a rye bread. You're going to find when you eat these two, they just don't taste as good. And you're going to realize, well, what you like most about them is the part that's hurting you. So it's better to replace them. And someone did ask about buckwheat. Buckwheat is not a grain, so you'll be perfectly fine consuming it. It's more like a barrier fruit. It's not as glutinous, so you're not going to get the same effects from it. It's harder to make bread and pasta from it, but that's a great transition. Amaranth, buckwheat, quinoa, what are the other ones? Millet, sorghum. These are great alternatives to grains, much easier in your stomach, but you're going to see, it's interesting. You're going to see, you're like, eat it, but you don't get that normal feeling of like satisfaction / addiction. So because you might equate satisfaction with being bloated, actually.
It's a lot lighter. It's a lot lighter.
It's totally lighter. Yeah, exactly.
Here's the next question. So tofu may help with hot flashes? ? From Kathleen.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's one of the things that it can help with, because it's like what it is. It's the reproductive organ of the plant. So when you consume it, it's actually replacing your ovaries. That's part of the research that I discovered that was so fascinating, is you could take plums or pomegranate or oranges or soy, and you can take out the ovaries from an animal and cause menopause, like literally menopause. And then you give one group these foods, and it's as if you never took out their ovaries. And that's because we were designed to live a very long time. And as our hormones and our, sexual organs start to, go through their cycles, and you get older, you're producing less hormone. That is when you take advantage of nature and you start utilizing these hormone-like compounds. Yeah.
Okay, here's a good question. Is organic corn okay? Question mark. Organic is non-GMO. That's important to touch on.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. That's why the organic certification is so important, is because it implies it's not genetically modified. So, I mean, you can now get non-GMO, non-organic, but there's pesticides in there. So, it's when you
That's
really
not
go in. Yeah, I know. When you really go into it, it's challenging, but that's why the organic movement, and that's why everything we do has become so popular, right? Is because people woke up to the fact that you have like death or you have life. Like, okay, we want life, so we're gonna have to support natural. But then you have like Amazon buys Whole Foods, and you get all these weird agendas start getting mixing in. So, I think we all know what the writing on the wall is that you want to support community, support agriculture, CSAs. You want to support independent health food stores. You want to support online platforms like this so we can keep serving you this information. You want to support the parallel structures like in your community where you have growers that you can barter with. Like, that's amazing.
Yeah,
That's
totally.
the resilience networks that we really need. Yeah,
The
exactly.
best is finding local farmers. That there's
Yeah.
nothing like it. Okay, here's a good one. Someone's freaking out here. They're saying, so cheese is out? Question mark. Cream?
If you
Question mark. All grass fed? Question mark.
I mean, the thing is if you have never removed cow's milk from your diet, I highly suggest it, just for the health benefits and for you to see how addictive it is. And again, addictive doesn't have to be a bad word. It just means that you might be self-medicating. Yeah, because everyone's dealing with immense stress, and that's what you're using it for. So when you just do it carefully and cautiously, just be compassionate with yourself. You're going to see like, oh gosh, I'm really craving that. Like, what could I do differently? And what you'll find is that when you make those disciplined actions, give it a night of unrest, or you did not sleeping because you didn't have your cheese, whatever it is, the next day you're going to feel clearer. You're going to have more energy. You're going to be lighter and less attached to the behaviors that are weighing you down. So it's going to be worth it. And then you're going to add in that void that's now open from the foods that weren't really that good for you with things that are good, that are going to be better for you and the planet. And then, before you know it, you're going on you're reversing the downward spiral, because every day we can either be on a downward spiral, which nutrition is actually the most important part of that, determining your mood and your energy and what you're putting in your body. Like, when you eat gluten, it's going to take a day or two to process that no matter what. But, try wake up with juice. I mean, I just have an incredible juicer here, and I just love it when I'm getting juice into my cells and the energy you get from it, right? And you too, Joel, tell us more.
No, I completely agree. I will say that if you're going to have cheese eventually, what you'd like is non-pasteurized, grass-fed, and organic. Those are the
Yeah.
three things that are a must if you're eating dairy, because
Amen.
that'll be a big difference. A2 casein, if you can find it. And the good part is, the good news is stores now are carrying, it's very well labeled like
Yeah.
A2 casein, because people know that the regular A1 stuff is just causing them to
Yeah.
be sick. So, but I agree 100% with Sarah. When you cut out dairy, it's like things will open up and you'll start to gravitate towards other food that your body will listen to, and that you will listen to, that your body is telling you to consume as well. So it'll create space that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially because a lot of people wake up, they have morbid hunger. It's like this acidosis in their gut, or it's undigested proteins. And they get that confused with hunger. So when you have true hunger, it's not necessarily what you think. And it might require you try what's recommended in Regenerate, my book, which is the apple diet, where you're cleansing your palate and you're removing from your schedule all the things you have to think about related to food, right? Like you have to buy it, you have to prepare it, you have to clean it, you have to digest it. And whereas if you just eat apples, which Joel, did you do it over a week?
Yeah, I did 7 days of apple.
That's
Yeah.
this guy and his discipline is such a good role model.
No, it was fun. I enjoy doing this kind of
I
stuff.
mean,
It's
so
fun.
tell us about your day. I mean, weren't you craving like a hamburger in the middle of the day?
Not at all. As a matter of fact, when I would eat the apple, I would just the
Huh?
flavors would explode in my mouth. And
Really?
it was fascinating to like appreciate the details of the flavors of that food. It was fantastic. It was
Wow.
fascinating. Yeah,
Wow.
and you're
You,
right. Not much. I mean, not much in terms of thinking about foods at all.
but
Yeah.
energy wise, you were working out still. You
Energy
was
wise, I felt amazing.
wow.
There's probably a couple times, but I've done water fasts and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So my body's kind of used to going through that. So I didn't have any energy depletion. I didn't have moments. But if somebody's going from a standard American diet to an apple diet, oh, you better believe that, day 2 or day 3,
Wow.
there'll be times there where they're starving, even though they're eating an apple, but it's because they're basically detoxing.
Yeah.
It's like they're getting rid of the heroin addiction of the morphine in their foods, basically, and
Oh,
they're detoxing from that
mhm.
legitimately.
Yeah.
So,
And it's
but then you eat an apple and it kind of like takes
uh-huh.
that
Yeah.
craving from 10 to a 6 and it's
Yeah.
manageable, right?
Well, and then you get the autophagy, right? Like you don't have to fully fast when your cells, there's an intelligent system in the body where your body will digest the the least healthy tissue
That's right
first, right?
first. Yeah.
And it just sequence. So
The
that could
zombie
be
cells, it
two.
gets rid of these zombie
Yeah.
cells, creates
Senescent cells.
full, like I want to say, like a density of life, of a
Wow.
really full life that you feel. So totally worth it. Any
I mean,
mono
it's,
diets really will allow that, but the apple is just
yeah.
so tasty and juicy. It's unbelievable. I couldn't believe it. It's
Yeah,
great.
you can eat the seeds because they have laetrile or B17, which the government made illegal to use for cancer because it worked. I mean, that's
That's
how
right. That's
powerful,
right. That's right.
and then or you can, it's like, or you can do the apples a favor, swallow the seed, because that was the point, about the poetry of these plants and animals supporting each other. That's how it all works.
Okay,
But
last one here.
okay.
Okay, well done. I got two more. Organic popcorn and organic cornmeal. Can we trust that these are really non-GMO? Question mark.
Good question. I mean, the standards have been watered down. It really depends on the brand. I mean, I like Bob's Red Mill. I remember I used to carry that
Yeah,
at the store. I just felt like, when you have smaller companies that, well, actually, you know what? I wonder
they
if they're
probably.
independent.
I think they got bought. I don't know.
Oh, shit. Bob's Red Mill. I bet they're all owned by Unilever at this
Yeah,
point.
exactly.
Ah,
Procter
who's
and Gamble.
okay. So my point though is, yeah, definitely I don't even remember it's too traumatizing. I don't even remember what the question was. Thinking about that. Just
Oh,
how
just
everybody,
organic is. Can you still trust that it's non-GMO?
oh, I see. Yeah. I mean, I think you can generally do that, but keep in mind the biosphere is such that you can't really control these variables very well, which is all the more reason why our movement needs to continue to grow so we can preserve the biosphere and have pockets at least where there are actual organic permaculture grown foods. Because without that, as we know, our genetic situation is it's permeable and promiscuous, meaning what we're eating daily is actually what we need for our genes to express themselves optimally. We're not in this like hermetically sealed off genetic situation, which we thought of for many years. So now it's really important what happens in the environment. We're so interconnected, and it is good to know that there are so many people waking up. But look at what Bill Gates is doing. He's literally buying up all the farmland in this country.
It's
You know
crazy.
what I mean? It's crazy. You couldn't have a more caricature of a Dr. Evil guy, right? I mean, I can't even give him credit because I think, there's probably BlackRock behind him, whatever, pulling the strings. But the point is that we're in a situation where we're going to start needing to grow our own food and, having our own land and, keeping ourselves as sovereign as possible.
Okay, last one here.
Yeah.
Okay, you don't do private consultation, but somebody's doing an elimination diet while monitoring blood sugar and still extreme fatigue and issues. Oh boy,
Okay. Yeah.
there's a lot to
Okay.
unpack there. I can
Yeah.
say, I can say that I've seen even so. even my wife, who we eat super healthy, who did a mono diet, elimination diet, she had extreme fatigue for about 2 weeks, but I've seen it last even up to 3 months on people, and then a switch
Well,
flips. So
huh.
you might want to. It just depends on what the mono is to check your blood sugar. You might want to also check for ketone levels in the bloodstream as well. That's something that you might want to look at. So there's a lot more questions with that one than meets the eye.
Oh yeah, guys, like I don't mean to suggest it's just a matter of eliminating a few foods and then everything goes away. Because like when you're dealing with like a lifelong adrenal fatigue situation, I bet that has something to do with it for you. Um, yeah, there's just a lot. Everyone's on their own healing journey, but I will say that if you do make the commitment to removing wheat from your diet, if you haven't done it already, and you eliminate cow's milk, okay, just get rid of it. That's milk, that's cheese. You are going to see your body respond. It is amazing what happens. So I would love to check in back with some of you guys and to get feedback on this, because I used to work with thousands of people, right? And that's how I met Joelle at the health food store, and they would just come in and we would just talk about my different philosophies of nutrition, and ultimately I would always see them do so well with this, and it was revolutionary for my own health. So I still eat that way ever since getting deep into this. It's definitely one reason why I still feel like I'm pretty healthy for my age, because I'm 51 now, and I hope to be young and healthy for another 100 years. I think it's possible.
Yeah,
So anyway, so
that's
this has been
great.
a lot of fun.
This has been fun. I was just going to say, I think we
Oh,
need to
yeah.
do more of this.
I think
Pick a
so.
couple of random topics. If anybody has topics that they want us to discuss, just add them in the chat so we can do that and jump on again. Because as you can see, Sarah is a walking encyclopedia.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of fun. Thanks so much, Joelle, for suggesting this. And we will be back on, because one thing we want to do at Green Med Info is not just be like a newsletter or website, but so you can connect with the passion and the inspiration for why this exists, because we are a community. We did go through 2 years, 3 years of nonstop attempts to deplatform us from the internet. And we went ahead and created our own platform for not just ourselves, but for you as well, called Unite.live. And then, of course, we only exist because of memberships and donations. So if you ever feel inclined, you know where to do that on Green Med Info. We'd love for your support and love for you to keep growing this community. But we will be coming back on, because this was a lot of fun, and it brings back, what I used to love to do, Joel. I used to just go out, get up on a soapbox and just share my passion around all these topics, and people love it, and I love their engagement. So let's do more.
Right on. Sounds
All
great.
right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for being part of this. See you again.